When Carmen Morales, 29 years old, appeared at the door of millionaire Alejandro Ruiz's mansion with a 4-year-old girl in her arms, she had no idea that this desperate plea would forever change two destinies. With torn clothes, disheveled hair, and eyes full of tears, Carmen spoke the words that froze Alejandro's blood. "Please, sir, may I clean your house in exchange for a plate of food for my daughter?" But when Alejandro looked closely at the girl's face, his world collapsed. Those eyes, that smile, that face shape was identical to his, impossibly identical, because this girl was the perfect portrait of his daughter Emma, who had died 5 years ago in a tragic accident. Or perhaps Emma had never really died. The Ruiz mansion stood majestically in the hills of the Madrid Sierra, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens that reflected the golden light of the Castilian sunset. Alejandro Ruiz, 45 years old, one of Spain's wealthiest businessmen with assets worth 500 million euros, was sitting in his office when he heard the doorbell echo through the empty mansion. It was a November afternoon. The cold mountain wind brought with it the aroma of pines and the clean mountain air. Alejandro wasn't expecting anyone. For 5 years he had lived practically in isolation after his wife Francisca and daughter Emma died in a traffic accident that had destroyed his life. The only people he saw were the housekeeper, who came 3 times a week, and his lawyers for business matters. The second ring annoyed him. Alejandro got up from the leather armchair where he was reading business documents and headed toward the main entrance. Through the video intercom, he saw a female figure in the shadows with something in her arms, probably another door-to-door salesperson or someone asking for donations. But when he opened the door, what he saw left him breathless. Before him stood a young woman of about 29, with long chestnut hair disheveled by the wind and green eyes full of desperation. She wore torn jeans, a worn red sweatshirt, and worn-out sneakers. In her arms, she held a 4-year-old girl with curly blonde hair and a little face sleeping against her mother's shoulder. The woman trembled not only from the cold, but from fear and the humiliation of what she was about to ask. When she raised her eyes to Alejandro, tears began sliding down her dirty cheeks. With a broken voice, she whispered the words that would change everything. She asked if she could clean his house in exchange for a plate of food for her daughter. They hadn't eaten in 2 days. Alejandro felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he had buried years ago. But while observing the woman who was begging for help, the girl in her arms slowly woke up. The little one lifted her head from her mother's shoulder and looked at Alejandro with sleepy blue eyes. In that moment, time stopped. Alejandro fixed his gaze on the girl's face and felt his blood freeze in his veins. Those blue eyes were identical to his own. That face shape, that small mole on the right cheek, even the way she tilted her head when confused. It was like looking in a mirror of the past, like seeing his daughter Emma again when she was 4 years old. The resemblance was so incredible, so precise, that Alejandro had to lean against the doorframe to keep from falling. His heart beat so hard he thought even the street could hear it. With a trembling voice, he asked the girl's name. The answer froze him. Emma. The girl's name was Emma, exactly like his dead daughter. Alejandro felt his world collapse. It wasn't possible. His daughter Emma had died 5 years ago. He had seen her body in the hospital. He had organized the funeral. He had cried over her grave for months. However, without saying anything more, Alejandro immediately let them in. While Carmen entered the mansion carrying Emma in her arms, Alejandro couldn't take his eyes off the girl. Each of her movements, every expression, every small gesture was identical to what he remembered of his daughter. It was as if the ghost of his past had materialized before him. But how was it possible? And who really was this woman who presented herself as Emma's mother? Alejandro accompanied Carmen and Emma to the mansion's grand living room with the fireplace lit, creating a warm and cozy atmosphere. The girl looked at everything with wide eyes, impressed by the house's dimensions and elegant furniture, while Carmen still seemed incredulous at having been invited in. While he prepared food in the kitchen, Alejandro continued secretly observing Emma. The girl had sat next to her mother and was playing with a worn rag doll, probably the only toy she owned. Each of her movements confirmed the incredible resemblance to his daughter. He returned to the living room with a tray full of food. Carmen thanked him with tears in her eyes, while Emma began eating with the appetite of someone who hadn't seen food in days. Alejandro asked them to tell him their story. Carmen explained that she had been widowed 2 years ago when her husband Marcos died in a workplace accident. Since then, she had struggled to get by, doing odd jobs and trying to raise Emma alone. 3 months ago, she had lost her job at a factory and could no longer pay rent. Since then, they had been sleeping in the car or in makeshift shelters, but Alejandro's attention was completely captured by Emma. The girl had finished eating and was now looking at the paintings hanging on the walls. When she saw a family photo with Alejandro, Francisca, and his original Emma, she got up and approached. With her sweet little voice, she said that the girl in the photo looked like her. Carmen looked at the photo and visibly paled. Alejandro explained that was his daughter Emma, who died 5 years ago, along with his wife, in a traffic accident. A heavy silence fell over the room. Then Emma did something that made Alejandro tremble. She called him Daddy, with the same intonation, the same sweet tone his daughter used to use. It was impossible. However, Carmen quickly took Emma by the hand, apologizing and explaining that the girl was confused. Alejandro suddenly got up and headed to his office. He had to verify something that could explain the impossible. He opened the safe and took out a folder he hadn't touched in years, all the documents related to the accident from 5 years ago. He reread everything carefully, looking for something he had previously missed. Then he found something strange. In the hospital report, there was a handwritten note in the margin. Problematic identification due to body conditions, additional DNA verification needed. He had never seen that note before. He searched through the papers and found another shocking document, a DNA test request signed by himself, but next to it was a sheet that said test cancelled at family's request, but he had never cancelled any test. He returned to the living room with trembling hands. Emma had fallen asleep on the sofa, curled up like a little angel, while Carmen sweetly covered her with a blanket. Alejandro asked Carmen a crucial question. Did she know anything about Emma's origins? Was she really her biological daughter? Carmen responded, offended, that of course she was her daughter, that she had given birth to her at El Escorial Hospital in 2019. Alejandro sat next to her and told her he believed there was something both of them needed to discover, something someone had hidden for 5 years. The next morning, Alejandro woke up early after a sleepless night. He had let Carmen and Emma sleep in the guest room, but hadn't managed to close his eyes. He went down to the kitchen and prepared breakfast, a gesture he hadn't made in years. When Emma arrived, she immediately ran to him, smiling and thanking him for letting them sleep there. Alejandro knelt to her level and asked if she remembered anything from when she was very small, before living with her mom. The girl reflected, but shook her head, remembering only her mom and Papa Marcos. Alejandro told Carmen they needed to go to El Escorial Hospital. He suspected there had been an error, or something worse, 5 years ago. He explained his theory. He believed the girl he had buried wasn't Emma, and that his Emma was this girl, whom he thought was dead. After an hour drive, they arrived at the hospital. Alejandro had called ahead and arranged a meeting with Dr. Benitez, the head of pediatrics, who was also on duty 5 years ago. Dr. Benitez received them in his office looking worried. When Alejandro asked him to look carefully at Emma, the doctor observed her and turned pale as a sheet, whispering that it wasn't possible. The doctor got up and went to a file cabinet. With trembling hands, he took out a medical history and opened it on the desk. What he revealed had shocked everyone. The night of the accident, not only Alejandro's wife and daughter were involved, there had also been another car with a couple and their girl. The couple had died instantly, but the girl had survived. Carmen's biological parents had died in that accident, but she wasn't with them that night. She had stayed with her grandparents. Emma was in the other car with Alejandro's wife, but there had been a tragic error during identification. The conditions were so severe that they had confused the girls' identities. The girl Alejandro had buried was the other family's daughter. Emma, his Emma, had survived and been sent to the orphanage as an orphan from the other family. Shortly after, Carmen and her husband Marcos had applied for adoption. Through a series of bureaucratic coincidences, they had been given Emma with a new identity. No one knew about the initial confusion. Alejandro looked at Emma, who was watching him with innocent blue eyes. His daughter was alive. His daughter had always been alive and had grown up just kilometers away without his knowing. But Dr. Benitez added that there was something else he needed to know. The error hadn't been completely accidental. Dr. Benitez closed his office door and returned to the desk with the air of someone about to reveal a terrible secret. He explained that shortly after the accident, he had received a visit from an elegant man who identified himself as a lawyer from Alejandro's insurance company. The man had convincing documents and knew private details about the family. He said he wanted to spare Alejandro the trauma of seeing his daughter in those conditions. The doctor, young and inexperienced, had believed him. The man had also offered a substantial donation to the hospital. Shortly after, the same man had returned with other documents, saying the surviving girl from the other accident should be quickly given to a family and that he had already found a perfect couple, Carmen and Marcos. Alejandro suddenly realized the scope of the manipulation. Someone had orchestrated everything, making Emma end up with Carmen and Marcos far from him. When the doctor described the tall man of about 50 with gray hair and a scar on his left hand, Alejandro immediately recognized him. It was Victor Mendoza, his former business partner, the man he had fired and reported for embezzlement just before the accident. The puzzle pieces began to fit together. Mendoza had always hated Alejandro's success and had sworn revenge when he was exposed. Dr. Benitez revealed other disturbing details. After Emma was given to Carmen's family, Mendoza continued coming regularly to the hospital. Once he had heard him say on the phone that Alejandro should never know the girl was alive, that his suffering was the price to pay. Alejandro clenched his fists. Mendoza had not only stolen millions of euros from him, but had also stolen 5 years with his daughter. 5 years of love, growth, irreplaceable moments that would never return. Carmen, who had listened to everything in silence, intervened, saying Alejandro should think of Emma first. The girl needed stability, not revenge. Alejandro looked at Emma, who had listened without really understanding what was happening. The girl looked at him with innocent blue eyes and smiled, calling him daddy again spontaneously. Alejandro's heart broke and mended at the same time. His daughter had called him daddy again, and this time he knew she really was his daughter. He told her sweetly that she had done nothing wrong. On the contrary, she had done something wonderful. She had returned to daddy. But while hugging Emma, Alejandro knew the battle had barely begun. He had to face Mendoza, but first he had to understand how to handle the situation with Carmen, who had raised Emma as her daughter for 4 years. The trip back to the mansion was charged with tension and silence. Emma slept in the back seat, oblivious to the emotional earthquake that had shaken the lives of the adults around her. Alejandro drove with his gaze fixed on the road while Carmen looked out the window with tears silently sliding down her cheeks. When they arrived at the mansion, Alejandro carried Emma to the guest room and tucked her in, sweetly kissing her forehead. For the first time in 5 years, he was saying goodnight to his daughter. The emotion was so intense, he had to leave the room to keep from bursting into tears. In the living room, Carmen sat on the sofa with trembling hands holding a cup of tea. Alejandro sat across from her, both conscious of the difficult conversation they had to face. Carmen explained that Emma was her life. She had raised her since she was 6 months old. She was the only family she had left after Marcos's death. Alejandro responded that he understood her pain, but Emma was also his daughter. He had lost 5 years with her, 5 years in which he had cried over her death and visited an empty grave. Carmen replied that she had spent 4 years loving Emma as if she were of her own blood, caring for her when she was sick, consoling her when she was afraid, teaching her to walk and talk. Alejandro stopped in front of the window looking at the dark garden. They faced an impossible dilemma. How to resolve the situation without destroying Emma? Both loved the same girl, both with legitimate but apparently incompatible rights. Then Alejandro had an idea. He asked Carmen if they necessarily had to choose. Emma needed both of them. Him because he was her biological father, but also her because she was the only mother she had known. He proposed they become a family, all three together. He wasn't talking about marriage, but about living together as a family, raising Emma together. Carmen had no house or job, and there was space for everyone in the mansion. Carmen initially protested, saying she couldn't accept his charity, but Alejandro explained it wasn't charity, it was a necessity. Emma needed stability, and the only possible stability was having both of them in her life. Carmen reflected for a long time, then asked what would happen with Mendoza. They couldn't let what he had done go unpunished. Alejandro tensed at his former partner's name, but Carmen was right. If they didn't stop him, he might try to separate them again or destroy other families. They decided they would face Mendoza together, with Emma safe but present, to show him what he had caused with his cruel games. The next day, Alejandro discovered that Mendoza lived in a mansion on the outskirts of Madrid, bought with stolen money. That night, while Emma slept, Alejandro and Carmen prepared for the encounter that would finally close the circle of Mendoza's revenge. It was time to face the past, to protect Emma's future and their new family. Mendoza's mansion was illuminated with soft lights when Alejandro and Carmen arrived the following night. They had left Emma with Alejandro's housekeeper after sweetly explaining that they had to settle an important matter for their future together. When Mendoza opened the door, his face transformed from a cordial smile to an expression of pure terror upon seeing Alejandro. The man stammered in surprise while Alejandro told him with an icy voice that he needed to talk to him about his daughter, Emma. Mendoza let them into his mansion's living room, furnished with expensive furniture, probably bought with money stolen from Alejandro. When Alejandro told him Emma was alive and that he had found her, Mendoza's face revealed total panic. The man collapsed into an armchair, his face in his hands. Under pressure, Mendoza confessed everything. When Alejandro had fired him and reported him, he had lost everything: wife, children, reputation. He wanted Alejandro to feel the same pain. He had orchestrated the identity swap, the false documents, the delivery to Carmen and Marcos. Carmen yelled at him that Emma was just an innocent girl, asking how he could have used her for his revenge. Mendoza explained that he thought growing up away from Alejandro she would be better off, that he didn't want to hurt her, just make Alejandro suffer. Alejandro approached Mendoza, rage boiling in his chest. He told him he had stolen 5 years of his life with his daughter, 5 years in which he had cried over an empty grave while she grew up believing she was an orphan. Mendoza admitted regretting it every day, that when he had seen how destroyed Alejandro was, he understood he had gone too far, but it was already too late to turn back. Alejandro took out his phone and showed Mendoza he was recording the conversation. He told him he had just confessed everything: kidnapping, document forgery, corruption. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. But before calling the police, Alejandro wanted to tell him something. His revenge had failed because instead of destroying his family, he had created something even more beautiful. Emma had had a wonderful mother who had loved her like her own daughter, and now all three were a family stronger than they ever would have been before. He explained that Carmen and Emma would live with him, that Emma would have the biological father she deserved and the mother who had raised her with love. Mendoza had tried to break a family, but had created a new one. 3 months later, the Ruiz mansion was completely transformed. Carmen had agreed to live there as an extended family, and gradually she and Alejandro had discovered they had much more in common than they imagined. It wasn't romantic love, at least not yet, but it was respect, affection, and a shared dedication to Emma. Emma had accepted the situation with typical childhood simplicity. Alejandro was her biological daddy, and Carmen was her heart mommy. And for her, this was perfectly normal. Mendoza had been arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison for his crimes. Before being taken away, he had written a letter to Alejandro asking for forgiveness and thanking him for not seeking physical revenge. One spring afternoon, while Emma played in the garden, Alejandro and Carmen sat on the terrace watching the sunset. They reflected on how it would have been if Emma had never appeared at the door that night. Alejandro would have continued being a bitter man who hated the world, and Carmen would still be homeless with a girl to raise alone. Fate had strange ways. Sometimes the most beautiful things were born from the most painful situations. Carmen began saying something about their future together, then blushed and stopped. Alejandro looked at her tenderly, telling her he didn't know what the future held for them, but that he respected her enormously, and Emma adored her. They would see the rest with time. Emma ran toward them, her blonde hair shining in the sun, calling both of them to come play with her. Alejandro and Carmen looked at each other smiling. That girl was calling both of them with names that represented love, not biology. They got up and ran to the garden where Emma waited for them with open arms. A family born from pain, grown in hope, and consolidated in the purest love, that of a girl who had brought together two broken hearts and helped them heal together. The story of Alejandro, Carmen, and Emma demonstrated that sometimes second chances come dressed as tragedies and that love can truly be born from the most improbable circumstances. If this story has touched your heart and made you believe in the strength of family love, give it a like and share. Alejandro, Carmen, and Emma prove that families are built not only with blood, but with love, dedication, and the will to fight together. Subscribe for more stories that celebrate the power of second chances and show that love can be born even from the most difficult situations. Activate the notification bell. Remember, sometimes the people we least expect become the most important in our lives. Never underestimate the power of destiny and the importance of opening your heart to unexpected possibilities.